The story is told in classrooms and celebrated with a national holiday. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, a brave Italian navigator sailing under the Spanish flag, discovered America. He is presented as a heroic figure who opened up a new world to European civilization, forever changing the course of human history. This tale is simple, powerful, and deeply ingrained in our collective consciousness. It suggests a vast, empty wilderness, waiting for a European touch to awaken it. We are taught to see his 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, as the very first vessels to bridge the gap between the known world of Europe and the unknown lands across the vast and forbidding Atlantic Ocean. However, this foundational story rests on a profound and troubling misunderstanding. How can one discover a land that is already inhabited? When Columbus and his men arrived in the Caribbean, they did not find an empty continent. They found a world teeming with millions of people, organized into complex societies with their own rich cultures, advanced agricultural systems, and sophisticated knowledge of their environment. These were the Taino, the Arawak, the Carib, and many other indigenous peoples. To claim Columbus discovered their home is to erase their existence and deny their history, treating them as mere fixtures of the landscape rather than the rightful inhabitants of the land they had called home for millennia. This fundamental contradiction opens the door to a much deeper and more complex truth. If the original inhabitants were already there, who else might have crossed the ocean before Columbus? The established narrative aggressively shuts down this line of inquiry, creating a historical fortress that protects the idea of European exceptionalism. It insists that only Europeans possess the technology, the ambition, and the courage to master the Atlantic. This view conveniently ignores the long and impressive maritime traditions of other civilizations, particularly those from Africa. The possibility of other transatlantic voyages has been dismissed, ridiculed, or simply ignored for centuries. The time has come to dismantle this myth and look at the evidence that has been hidden in plain sight. This is not just a matter of correcting a historical inaccuracy. It is about restoring a stolen legacy and understanding the true, interconnected history of our world. The story of who first crossed the Atlantic is far more intricate and fascinating than the simplified tale we have been told. It involves not just Europeans, but also ancient mariners from other continents who left their mark on the Americas long before 1492, challenging everything we thought we knew about the dawn of the modern age and the origins of American history. Long before European ships ever appeared on the horizon, other visitors may have reached the shores of the Americas. The evidence for this is not hidden in some obscure text, but comes directly from the records of Christopher Columbus himself. During his second voyage to the Caribbean, he documented a fascinating account shared by the native people of Hispaniola, the island that is now home to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They told him stories of black-skinned people who had come to the island from the south and southeast. These were not random or isolated visitors. They arrived in large boats and were clearly skilled navigators who knew the ocean currents and trade winds. These accounts were not treated as mere folklore by Columbus. The indigenous people provided him with physical proof of these earlier encounters. They showed him the spearheads that these African visitors had brought with them. These were not made of stone or wood but of a metallic alloy, a mixture of gold and other metals. The natives had a specific name for this metal guanin. This word and the object it described were a direct link to a world beyond their own, a testament to a history of contact that predated European arrival. Columbus was so intrigued by this discovery that he took some of these spearheads with him and sent them back to Spain for analysis. The implications of this account are staggering. It suggests a dynamic, multi-ethnic world in the pre-Columbian Americas, where different peoples met, traded, and exchanged knowledge. The Atlantic was not an impenetrable barrier, but a highway for those who knew how to navigate it. The presence of African voyagers, as described by the native inhabitants of Hispaniola, points to a sophisticated maritime culture in West Africa, capable of making return journeys across the ocean. These were not accidental castaways blown off course but organized expeditions that carried goods for trade, such as the guanin-tipped spears, a clear sign of purposeful exploration and commercial interaction. This forgotten chapter of history completely reframes our understanding of the American past. It tells us that African history in the Americas did not begin with the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade in the 16th century. Instead, it began centuries earlier with proud and capable mariners who crossed the ocean as explorers, traders, and diplomats. They arrived not in chains but in their own magnificent boats, bringing with them their technology, their culture, and their knowledge. This narrative of early African arrival provides a powerful counterpoint to the painful history that followed, revealing a story of agency and achievement that has been systematically erased from our history books. The spearheads that Columbus collected from the natives of Hispaniola became a crucial piece of physical evidence, a tangible link between two continents. When these artifacts were assayed back in Spain, the results were astonishingly precise and confirmed the stories Columbus had heard. The metal alloy, which the natives called guanin, was found to be composed of 18 parts gold, 6 parts silver, and 8 parts copper. This was a very specific metallurgical formula, not a random mix of metals. It was a signature, a chemical fingerprint that could be traced back to its origin. This composition was not something that could have been easily replicated by chance. It was a product of a specific and advanced metalworking tradition. Remarkably, this exact same alloy was well known in West Africa. Metalworkers there had been producing this specific mixture of gold, silver, and copper for centuries. Even more compelling, the name for this alloy in the Manda languages of West Africa was also guanin. The linguistic match was as perfect as the metallurgical one. This was not a coincidence. It was direct, verifiable proof that the spearheads found in the Caribbean had been manufactured in West Africa. The word and the object had traveled together across the Atlantic, carried in the boats of West African mariners who traded these very items. The Spanish authorities, however, did not publicize this incredible finding, revealing that West Africans had established trade routes to the Americas before them would have severely weakened Spain's claim to the New World under the doctrine of discovery. Such a revelation would have opened the door for other powers, particularly Portugal, which had strong ties to West Africa, to make their own claims on the territories. And so, this powerful piece of evidence was quietly suppressed, buried in the archives. The story of Columbus as the sole discoverer was far more politically convenient, and the truth about the guanin spearheads became a casualty of imperial ambition and colonial politics. The story of guanin is a powerful illustration of how a single object can rewrite history. It demonstrates that West Africans possessed not only the seafaring capability to reach the Americas, but also the advanced metallurgical skills to create valuable goods for trade. The spearheads were not just weapons, they were symbols of a sophisticated culture that was exploring the world and establishing international connections. They are a silent testament to a forgotten age of African exploration, challenging the Eurocentric narrative and proving that the Atlantic was crossed from east to west long before Columbus embarked on his fateful journey. The heroic image of Christopher Columbus planting a flag on the shores of America is a powerful piece of cultural mythology, but it bears little resemblance to what actually happened. One of the most glaring inaccuracies in the popular story is the simple fact that Columbus never set foot on the North American continent. His 4 voyages took him to the islands of the Caribbean and the coasts of Central and South America, but he never reached the land that would later become the United States. His first landing on October 12, 1492, was on a small island in the Bahamas, which he named San Salvador. His explorations were confined to this region, primarily focused on Hispaniola and Cuba. Upon his arrival, Columbus and his men were not met with hostility. The native Taino people welcomed them with generosity and curiosity, sharing their food and resources. Columbus's own diary entries describe them as gentle, intelligent, and peaceful. However, this initial period of goodwill was tragically short-lived. Driven by an insatiable hunger for gold and a profound sense of cultural and racial superiority, Columbus and his crew quickly turned to unimaginable brutality. They unleashed a reign of terror upon the very people who had welcomed them, initiating a cycle of violence that would lead to one of the most devastating genocides in human history. The atrocities committed under Columbus's command are a horrifying stain on human history. To force the natives to find gold, he instituted a brutal tribute system. Every Taino over the age of 14 was required to deliver a certain quota of gold every 3 months. Those who failed to meet their quota had their hands cut off and were left to bleed to death as a terrifying example to others. Eyewitness accounts from the time, including those from the Spanish priest Bartolomé de las Casas, detail horrific acts such as murdering infants for sport, feeding live babies to dogs, and hanging natives in groups of 13 in a blasphemous reenactment of Christ and his apostles. This systematic violence, combined with forced labor in mines and plantations, and the introduction of European diseases like smallpox to which the native population had no immunity, had a catastrophic effect. The population of the Americas plummeted. It is estimated that before Columbus's arrival, the population of the Americas was around 15 million people. By the 17th century, it had fallen to less than 1 million. This was not an accidental consequence of contact, it was the direct result of a deliberate policy of exploitation and extermination. This brutal reality is the true legacy of Columbus's voyages, a far cry from the sanitized tale of heroic discovery. Long before the evidence of African presence in the Americas gained wider attention, a brilliant and meticulous scholar named Leo Wiener was piecing together the puzzle. Wiener was a Russian-born philologist and historian who became a distinguished professor at Harvard University. He was a polymath, fluent in dozens of languages, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of history and culture. In the early 20th century, a time when such ideas were considered radical and even heretical, Wiener dedicated himself to proving that African civilizations had made contact with the Americas long before Columbus. His groundbreaking research was a direct challenge to the established historical orthodoxy of his day. Between 1920 and 1922, Wiener published his monumental 3-volume work. In this exhaustive study, he compiled an overwhelming amount of evidence drawn from his deep expertise in linguistics, botany, and ethnography. He meticulously documented the surprising and undeniable similarities between the languages, religious practices, and agricultural products of West Africa, and those found among the indigenous civilizations of Mesoamerica. Wiener argued that these parallels were too numerous and too specific to be mere coincidences. They could only be explained by direct and sustained contact between the two regions across the Atlantic Ocean. Wiener's work was revolutionary, but it was largely met with silence and dismissal from the academic establishment of his time. The prevailing scholarly consensus was heavily invested in the narrative of European supremacy and the idea of an isolated new world awaiting European discovery. The notion that Africans could have been capable of such sophisticated maritime achievements was simply unthinkable to many in the early 20th century, an era rife with scientific racism and colonial arrogance. Wiener's meticulous evidence was cast aside, and his conclusions were ignored. He was a voice crying out in a wilderness of prejudice, and his pioneering work was sadly relegated to the footnotes of history. Despite the academic community's initial rejection, Leo Wiener laid the essential groundwork for all future research into the pre-Columbian African presence in the Americas. His rigorous methodology and the sheer volume of evidence he assembled provided a solid foundation upon which later scholars, including myself, could build. He was the first to systematically connect the dots, to show that the linguistic and botanical trails led directly from the Americas back to Africa. Though his voice was not heeded in his own time, his work stands today as a powerful testament to a truth that could not remain buried forever, a pioneering effort to restore a lost chapter of world history. One of the most compelling lines of evidence for pre-Columbian contact between Africa and the Americas can be found not in human records, but in the silent testimony of plants. The distribution of certain domesticated plants across both sides of the Atlantic before 1492 presents a fascinating puzzle that cannot be explained by conventional theories of wind and ocean currents alone. Many of these plants required human cultivation to propagate, meaning their seeds had to be physically carried across the ocean. The presence of identical or closely related species in both West Africa and the Americas strongly suggests that ancient mariners acted as a botanical bridge, transporting these vital crops from one continent to another. Consider the case of the bottle gourd. This is a plant of African origin, and archaeological evidence shows it was being cultivated in the Americas as early as 8000 BCE, thousands of years before it ever appeared in Polynesia. The gourd was an incredibly useful plant, used for making containers, utensils, and musical instruments. Its early presence in the Americas, long before any known European or Asian contact, points to an ancient transatlantic connection. Similarly, certain varieties of yams and specific types of domesticated cotton, which required complex processing, were found in both regions, suggesting a transfer of not just the plants themselves, but also the agricultural knowledge needed to grow and use them. The story of the peanut and tobacco also adds intriguing layers to this botanical mystery. Peanuts are native to South America, yet they were being cultivated in Africa and even reached China before Columbus's voyages. How did they get there? The most logical explanation is that mariners from the Americas or Africa transported them across the Atlantic. Conversely, some scholars have pointed to evidence of tobacco, a plant native to the Americas, being found in ancient Egyptian mummies. While this specific claim remains debated, it is part of a larger body of botanical evidence that strongly indicates a two-way exchange of plants and knowledge across the ocean long before it was thought possible. These plants are living artifacts. They tell a story of human migration and interaction that is written into their very DNA. The exchange was not a one-way street from the old world to the new, but a dynamic process of back-and-forth travel. This botanical evidence powerfully supports the idea that African navigators not only reached the Americas, but also established connections significant enough to facilitate the transfer of key agricultural resources. These crops, which sustained communities on both continents, are perhaps the most enduring and vital proof of a shared history that has been overlooked for far too long. Language is a living map of human history, and its words carry the echoes of ancient migrations and cultural exchanges. When we examine the languages of ancient Mesoamerica, we find surprising and compelling connections to the languages of West Africa. As the scholar Leo Wiener first systematically documented, there are numerous place names, titles for kings and dignitaries, and names for objects and religious concepts in Native American languages that bear a striking resemblance to words from African languages, particularly those from the Mande language family, as well as Arabic, which was a lingua franca in West Africa due to trade and the spread of Islam. These linguistic parallels go far beyond simple, coincidental similarities in sound. For example, the name of the ancient Mexican god of merchants and travelers, Yacatecutli, can be broken down into sounds that have direct meaning in the Mande languages of West Africa, relating to trade and pilgrimage. Similarly, many of the titles for rulers and nobles recorded by early Spanish chroniclers in Mexico and Central America appear to be derived from West African terms for similar positions of power. These are not isolated examples, but part of a wider pattern of linguistic borrowing that points to a period of significant cultural interaction between the two regions. The word Guanan itself, as discussed earlier, is a prime example of this linguistic trail. The fact that the exact same word was used on both sides of the Atlantic to describe the exact same metallurgical alloy is irrefutable evidence of direct contact. It represents a clear transfer of both technology and terminology. Another example can be found in the word for the dugout canoe. In several indigenous languages of the Caribbean and Central America, the word for a large canoe is remarkably similar to West African words for the same type of vessel, suggesting that perhaps the technology and the name for it traveled together across the ocean. These linguistic fingerprints show that the contact between Africans and Americans was not fleeting or superficial. For words and titles to be adopted into a language, there must be a period of sustained and meaningful interaction. It implies a relationship built on trade, diplomacy, and the exchange of complex ideas. The voices of ancient West Africa can still be heard today, embedded in the languages of the Americas. This linguistic evidence, when combined with the botanical and archaeological proof, paints a vivid picture of a world that was far more interconnected than traditional history has ever allowed us to believe. The established narrative that Christopher Columbus discovered America is more than just a historical error. It is a foundational myth that has shaped our understanding of the world for over 500 years. This story deliberately erases the rich and complex histories of the indigenous peoples who had thrived in the Americas for thousands of years. It also silences the incredible achievements of other seafaring cultures, particularly those from Africa, who possessed the skill and courage to cross the Atlantic long before any European. The time has come to challenge this outdated and harmful narrative and embrace a more accurate and inclusive version of the past. The evidence for a pre-Columbian African presence in the Americas is overwhelming and comes from multiple independent lines of inquiry. We have the direct testimony of Columbus himself, who recorded native accounts of black traders. We have the physical proof of the Guanan spearheads, with their specific metallurgical and linguistic links to West Africa. We have the undeniable botanical evidence of African plants, like the bottle gourd being cultivated in the Americas, and American plants like the peanut being grown in Africa. And we have the linguistic trail, with African words for gods, kings, and objects embedded in the languages of ancient Mesoamerica. It is crucial to remember that the story of the first Americans is itself a tale of ancient migration. Long before any Africans or Europeans arrived, people from Asia crossed the Bering Strait land bridge some 15,000 years ago, populating the two continents from north to south. The Americas have always been a destination for explorers and migrants from across the globe. Recognizing the voyages of ancient Africans does not diminish the story of the first peoples or the later history of European colonization. Instead, it adds a vital and enriching chapter to the human story, revealing a past that was far more dynamic and interconnected than we ever imagined. Ultimately, we must rethink what we are taught and what we choose to believe about who discovered America. The question itself is flawed, rooted in a colonial mindset. The Americas were never lost. They were simply unknown to Europeans. The true story of this hemisphere is one of multiple arrivals, of complex interactions between diverse peoples over many millennia. By acknowledging the evidence of an early African presence, we not only correct the historical record, but we also restore a legacy of Black achievement that predates the tragedy of slavery. We begin to see the Atlantic not as a barrier, but as a bridge, and the history of the world as a single shared story of human exploration and endeavor.